Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Galaxies events on Crowdcast. Tonight, I have the pleasure. Before I forget, I'm Kellyanne. I know I haven't been doing a lot of these hosting events. It's normally Constance, but my name is Kellyanne. I'll be hosting the event tonight. Tonight, we have Heidi Heilig and Justina Ireland with us tonight. We are celebrating Heidi's new book, which came out today, On This Unworthy Scaffold. Yay! Virtual round of applause. This beautiful book. On This Unworthy Scaffold is the final installment in Heidi's The Shadow Players trilogy, which is I'm not going to spoil this book if you haven't started from book one. It's a rich YA fantasy inspired by Southeast Asian cultures and French colonialism. It's full of magic, romance, high-stakes epic adventure, all of our favorite things in YA. We are big fans of YA here at the store. And we also have Justina Ireland with us tonight, who is also one of our favorite YA authors. You might recognize her as the author of Dread Nation and Deathless Divide. Really quick, before I get started and hand this off to Justina, some house rules. On the right-hand side is the chat section. Feel free to say hello to our authors there, anything you'd like. And below our video is a green book that says buy books with signed book plates, which will take you to Mysterious Galaxies so you can buy books and you'll get signed book plates from our authors. And last but not least, most importantly, probably for our virtual events, below that, there's the Ask a Question button. You want to click that, it'll open a little pop-up window for you and you can type in whatever questions you want to ask our authors, which that's the beauty of virtual events. I say take advantage of that. The authors are at your mercy. So with that, I'm going to hop off screen and I'll see you guys at the end of the event. Have a good one.
Thank you, Kellyanne.
It's awesome. Sorry, I was a little distracted. My fat cat, he's fat, he's like 20 pounds, is like chasing a bug. And so he just jumped like shoulder height from me, which is something he doesn't do. So I'm just like,
I was going to ask that in the question box, but I'm glad you explained.
Yeah, I was like why are you distracted?
Who is that?
Ghost? Exorcism. So welcome, friends, to joining with us and talking about Heidi's newest book. Yay! Finished a trilogy.
Finally. My editor is somewhere there and she's like, thank God it's done. It feels weird. Gosh, 3 books was a lot of book, but it was a lot of story to tell. And I think, it's kind of sad to leave it behind, but it's also it feels like an accomplishment. It feels like, it's a lot of book. So
a lot of story.
Yeah. So, but it was, I don't know, I have a lot of mixed feelings. It's always really hard for me to let go of things. So letting go of like an entire series is like way more than letting go of like a single book. But it is also really nice to say like, fly free. I can no longer rewrite you.
It's like your story is what it is.
Yes.
Hope everyone likes it.
Let it go.
So we're going to have this as a conversation, but I do want to share with everyone that Heidi came up with all these questions because literally she is the best person at being prepared for things. And I am not. And so she came up with these amazing questions. But again, if you guys have questions, please just drop it in the question box down. Well, I'm on my left-hand side of my screen, so it's down there for me. But I guess if I'm on the right hand of your screen, it's this side here. And just go ahead and ask us questions because those are always the best questions to ask because we know the questions we've asked ourselves. And if you have new questions are fancy. So let's talk about the undead, or ghosts, or those things that keep chasing us. So that we both use the undead. It's sort of as a metaphor or common theme in our books. So Heidi, why do ghosts and spirits, and as you say, rotting corpses, inspire us?
Justina, it's funny because I really wanted this to be like a conversation because you also have a new book coming out in like less than a month now.
I know, it's so soon. But it's middle grade, and like middle grade's like super chill. Like YA is like, book! And middle grade's like, yeah, I wrote a book. And I'm not saying that as like a bad thing. It's really nice. It feels like everything takes place at half speed for middle grade.
Really?
And the books.
Well, I hear that the tail is like longer though. Like you have to, it has to be relevant for longer. But anyway, I know it's a whole different, I don't know, world. I haven't entered it yet. But the reason I came up with questions like this was because I really did think that they, and the reason I asked you in the first place, aside from admiring you and having your number so you couldn't say no, is that I find these themes seem to be similar, and I also really would love to hear about why the dead call to you. But for me, I think just the idea of it's like a very, it seems really obvious, like the ghosts of the past are always haunting us. The things that we're trying to get rid of and want to stay buried just keep coming back and coming back and coming back. Also, where I grew up in Hawaii, we had a lot of blended, there was like a lot of religions that sort of came head to head, and like Shintoism and Buddhism and a sort of local animism and like just an idea that there were spirits everywhere became something that I believe in. And so when I think about that idea, the idea that everything has a spirit that is sort of perpetual and sort of maintains itself, I started to think about mental illness, and I started to think about who I was as a person. Is the mental illness that I experience, is it in my body? Is it in my soul? Or is it a part of me? Is it something separate? If I was reincarnated, would I still, that essential part of who I am, would it still be me? Would I still be me without it? And so I thought about all of these things when I was sort of coming up with the religions in the book, and the idea of a shadow puppeteer who was also insane, who could put those spirits into the puppets and bring the sort of animus of the soul into the action of the puppet, and sort of what that would mean for all of the above.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I actually think a lot of the same things, which is just really goes to show that like you really have to think about things very deeply if you're going to write books, including like, what does it mean to be alive? Like I always joke about like my existential dread before I fall asleep. It's like, what happens if I don't wake up? Will I recognize that I'm dead? Do I know that I'm dead? If I'm dead, what happens to me? What happens to my consciousness? Does it just stop? There's a law of conservation of energy. Is the energy conserved, and do I become something new? And if I'm something new, do I remember who I was before? And is everything I'm doing now, echoes of what I did before as well? And I think for me, in my storytelling, that's where I always bring in the historical aspects, because for me, history feels like a safer way to explore that sort of like existential dread instead of just like dwelling in it as a story. So I tend to, I like in Dread Nation, Death's Divide, I use zombies, and in Ophi's Ghost, I, use ghosts, literal ghosts, because I do think, sort of, you bring up Hawaii because Hawaii, was colonized, had a very like, fraught past, and even with, the immigration, and bringing in, like low paid laborers, like from China and other places. Like, it's a really, really kind of a microcosm of all the terrible things that happened in America just happened in this one little island. And I think about that a lot is like, when you don't address those, that trauma, and you don't address those terrible things that happened in the past, are we doomed to keep repeating them? But one of the things that's really funny, or not funny, like really one of the things that you say that's cool, I've been told like my use of funny sometimes comes out across as condescending, and so I'm trying to not say it because I usually use it as like when I don't have another word to fill in there. But one of the things that's really cool that you bring up is like the idea that spirits inhabit places, because that's one of the things in Ophi's Ghost is, she sees ghosts, but then there are also like inanimate places that also see the ghosts and also talk about what's happening in history at this time, because this takes place in 1920, so it's the Great Migration. So I do think there is something really nice about taking those things that we find fearful and awful and horrifying and bringing them into a story as either a catalyst of plot to move the plot forward, or as a way to address, the bigger things. I think it's a lot easier to talk about ghosts than it is mental health, because we're so fearful of ideas of mental health and like what it means when we don't have mental health, or the people around us, feel like they're floundering. But ghosts are a thing people like will always want to talk about. So it's like, if you can't talk about mental health, let's just talk about ghosts and cool shadow puppets and use that as kind of a way into the mental health.
I agree. I think that people also often would attribute, like, instead of thinking that someone was crazy, they would think that there was a bad spirit in them, or there was like, this was like, obviously like certain Asian cultures would feel that way, or, that people would mistake, poltergeist activity or something for their own, or mistake their own problems for other outside forces. And I think it is really interesting to see what sort of is in those like liminal spaces of the mind. I wanted to ask though, also, have you ever seen a ghost? Have you ever have you ever been in a haunted space or anything like that? Felt that way?
Yeah. So this is really weird. So I did not necessarily believe in ghosts until like maybe a couple of years ago. And I had so when I was doing the first round of stuff for the Star Wars project I worked on, the High Republic, we were at Skywalker Ranch, which is in Marin County in Northern California. And the way it's set up is like, if you guys don't know, Skywalker Ranch is like George Lucas's like fancy ranch that he then became like where they do industrial light and sound. And then, so it's like office buildings, but there's also like sort of like an inn there. And then there's like vineyards all around because now there's like George Lucas makes wine, because I guess that's what rich people do when they get bored. It's like, now I'm a winery. But I was in this room and someone had handed me a drink and I didn't really want it. And so, you like sometimes when somebody hands you a drink, you're like, I'm not going to drink this, but I'm going to be polite. I'm going to take this. And I had gone back to my room that night and I'd set the drink on my bedstand because I was like, I'll just deal with it in the morning. Because I'm also a lazy person when it gets bedtime. Like I'm the terrible person who skips brushing their teeth sometimes because I'm like, oh, I'll just get it in the morning. And then my husband's like, you're going to hate your life if you wake up with like that, that mouth after you forget. I'm like, yeah. So I was just kind of like I was like ready for bed. It'd been a long day. And the next morning, I legit thought someone had opened the door and come in my room. And I was like, oh shit. My first response was, oh shit, I overslept. It must be housekeeping, right? Because like they must have knocked. And so I like sit up right up in bed, and it's like 4:35 a.m. There is no one in my room. And I'm just like, and it's like that kind of darkness where like there's lights outside, but it's you can see everything. And I didn't see anything, but I would have sworn there was somebody else in the room. So like I did the really smart thing where you run to the bathroom and turn on all the lights. And I'm like ready to like fight. And then I saw like the glass of alcohol next to my thing. And I remember like one of the things that I had read when I was studying like hoodoo and like a lot of like if you guys don't know, hoodoo is like West African magic that came over and sort of becomes like a folk medicine later on. But one of the things they always talk about is like, you can't leave out strong liquor or spirits because it'll attract ghosts. And so I dumped that glass down the sink and I ran the water, but I was like creeped out like the rest of that morning until the sun came out, because I was like convinced that somebody, and that is the only time I've ever had any kind of thing. And it's the only time I've ever been like, yeah, something weird. And like later on, you found out like that part of like wherever I was staying was part of the old bunkhouse. So then everyone was teasing me like some old cowboy was trying to drink the whiskey. He's like, thanks. And I'm like, I don't want any ghosts. Yeah, no, I believe all of that. And I believe in it. And I believe that to think that we know all the stuff that exists in this world is just kind of hubris. And well, we all know what happens with hubris. It never ends well.
I agree with you there. I think that there is a lot more than you can, I don't know. I was actually obsessed for a really long time. And then later on, I found out that this was like a falsehood. So I got really mad. But I got really obsessed for a while with the whole story that like when you die, you lose like an ounce or something. Like if you die on a scale, your body like loses half an ounce. And it's like, that's the soul. But then I was like, oh, that's something someone like made up. So I was mad.
Wait, so have you ever seen a ghost? Have you ever had like a...
So I mentioned this story in the author's note of my first book, but the only time I've ever like had a weird experience was when I was actually outside my husband's, like we were kids at the time. We were like kids in Hawaii and 15 or 16. And I was like outside his house in Manoa Valley. And Manoa Valley is like one of the most like known as or thought of as one of the most haunted places in Hawaii. Like there are a lot of old houses there, a lot of obviously old places where the Hawaiians would lived and land that was stolen and all kinds of other things. Lots of also people have crashed on the roads that go down, like it's a sort of twisty, windy road. So we were like hanging out on his front porch or something. And on the side of the mountain, it was a sheer mountain face. We saw a greenish, like it looked like torchlight. And so obviously the legend, or not obviously, but the legend is like in Hawaii, I think that they talked about this in Finding Ohana, that you would see the night marchers. The night marchers are like the old spirits of ancient chieftains. And if you heard them drumming and you saw the light of their fire, you had to throw yourself down on the ground or else they would take you to march with them forever if you dared to look at them. So we saw this greenish what looked like torchlight on the sheer side of the mountain, and it's like no one could have gotten up there. It was like on the rock. It was like on a rock face. It's like, what is that? And we both went inside. We're not staying out here. But it was the only time, and we looked for it after that. Every time we came by to his house, like on the weekends, late at night, we would go out there and look for the light every so often, and we never saw it again. So it wasn't like like an installation of like where people climbed or something for planes or anything like that. We just never saw it again after that. But yeah, so that was like my one weird encounter. Not as like crazy as a cowboy stealing your whiskey, but
I told that story, but I was like legit freaked out for like the next day. And like, it sounds like a funny story at the time, but I literally thought, I'm gonna die because some like cowboy ghost is gonna murder me in my sleep because there's nothing good that comes to cowboys. Like we all know this, right?
But you'd think that leaving out whiskey would like appease them, right?
I don't know, man. I don't like to mess with ghosts. Like when everyone goes to New Orleans and they're like, let's do this ghost tour. I'm like, you do that. I'm not taking home a ghost in my
I actually saw, can I tell you, I actually saw the most amazing ghost story horror movie today. It was called His House.
Yes. So good. Yeah.
Speaking of mental health and ghosts and like colonialism it was amazing. So if you all like horror movies and ghost stories and anything like that, it was very, very, it was a tough watch, but it was amazing. So
yeah, it's really good. And it doesn't go where you think it's going to go. And it's just so
the twist.
Yeah.
Oh, anyway. Okay. I'm sorry. Books. All right.
Yes. So let's talk about history. So we both turn to history or alternate history for inspiration. How do you decide what you're going to pull from history and what you're going to just leave behind in the trash pile?
So that is, I don't know why I wrote these questions because I didn't come up with answers. I was like, Justina will have a good answer for this. So I was a lot more, I was very strict about history and like historical accuracy and stuff in my first series in The Girl from Everywhere, because I really wanted, it's a time travel book about like piracy and actually the like part of the theft of gold and land in Hawaii and all that sort of 19th century like sugar baron evil and time travel and pirate ships. So I wanted the time travel to feel really realistic by sticking to history and like by going like by really, really like researching every place and like making sure that if you took a left turn on like Date Street, you were on the right road. And I grew up watching like Hawaii 5-0 reruns, and like you would like turn on one street and like wind up in a totally different city, and it was always like really weird. But with this series, I wanted to break free of that. I wanted to use history as like an inspiration, but not as like a roadmap. I wanted to serve the story instead. So things that I pulled out of history were historical treatments for mental illness, again, like a lithium spring, and like the fact that like lithium works to treat mental illness and depression a lot. And I wanted to, I was inspired also by Leonardo da Vinci and in one of the scientists, in the main like army scientist. And I was also, what else? I just remembered this the other day. The Rite of Spring, the riot that was caused by the ballet, the Rite of Spring in like 1912 or something. That inspired me in this latest book to write a scene where Jetta was performing in a sort of a French opera house, and like her obviously using like necromancy in her shadow puppeteering sort of causes like a big brouhaha in like a city that's a lot like Paris. So that also inspired me, but it was more these little bits and pieces of history that I could like put together and reimagine in my own way, as opposed to like, I don't know. I loved being like very like well-researched and strict about it in the first books, but I wanted to do something different with these. What about you?
Oh, I hate that. I hate being strict. No, I'm not going to.
You had a whole alternate history in Dread Nation.
Yeah,
you like took a jumping off point and went.
Yeah, and I think like, and even with like Ophi, like there's a lot of stuff that is happening in the background that I don't bring in just because, for middle grade readers, I really don't think they want a dry ass history. Like they're like, oh, I promised you ghosts, but here's the Teapot Dome scandal instead.
I love the Teapot Dome scandal, Justina.
That's the scandal, man.
The best scandal, absolutely.
So bad. And so like, that's one of the things like I try to do. Like I try to actually leave out the history that you're going to learn in school because I feel like kids will get that. And I always try to write about the history that people don't talk about. And so I did that for Dread Nation. Dread Nation was really great, though, because I did have a jumping off point. And then I was like, all right, all of this stuff happened and none of this stuff has happened. And now I can just remix it how I want. But that's also sometimes dangerous, too, because people really love those historical moments. And then when you don't give them the historical moment they're looking for, they're like, well, she obviously doesn't know her history because that's not how it went. And I'm like, well, there's zombies, guy. Like, like, what do you want me to do? But I do think it's important to realize when you're using history that it is really freeing to use it as an inspiration. I was talking about Dread Nation and the idea of this American mythology. And, we always, mythologize, lost cultures, the Greeks and the Romans. But America really has its own mythology as well. And I think when you're writing a story and you're using fiction, or excuse me, when you're using history for your fiction, it's sometimes helpful to remember that like the history we know is always a little wrong to a lot wrong. And so it's a really good way to like get yourself into a story. The same way you would use Greek mythology or, Mesopotamian, Sumerian mythology as well. So I usually try to look at history as that, like sort of more of a guideline, as a story that we've already told, like a fairy tale, right? Like we have, the Boston Tea Party is a fairy tale about America. I'm pretty sure nobody was really excited to see people dressing up as like natives and dumping tea in the harbor because like, people own that tea. And there were stores that were looking for that tea. And then also there are native people who were like, what the hell, man? Like, we're minding our own business, just trying to like live our lives. And you're trying to put that on us. So I do think, I think history, I do always worry when I talk to especially aspiring authors and they want to write historical fiction and they're like, I know exactly what the weather was on this date. And it's like, okay, but what's the story you're telling? Right? Because we have history books. You're not writing a history book. That's a whole other discipline. You're writing fiction and you have to make it appealing. And, relaying the weather report from 6, different newspapers that you pulled up and researched isn't interesting. But like, what's your character doing? Like, is the rain going to ruin like her day because she was going to like the gardens with some dude that she likes? Or like, is the rain going to have no impact on her because she's a scullery maid and she doesn't get to see outside anyway? Like, so I think that's one of the things like I really have enjoyed about this fantasy series that you wrote is that your historical inspirations are clear, but you're also not so like bogged down in them that you don't do like fun things like,
my editor, if she's Is she still here? I think she is. She's like, yes, Heidi, remember what Justina is saying, because there was a time when so some of the story, as you know, Justina, is told in ephemera, like, telegrams or sheet music or play scripts. And there was a time when I was like, Martha, I know what I'm going to do. Can I have an excerpt from a history book of the history of this, like, written later? And she was like, no. She said it nicer. She was like, Heidi, I don't think that they want to read a history textbook. And I was like, but I would. So I think when you say that no one cares about the Teapot Dome scandal, I think that maybe most normal people don't care about that. But I think that I, as like a 12-year-old, might have cared about that. But I think ultimately, yes, you are correct that generally speaking, it's better to leave the history book to the historians.
Tell her not to talk to Jordan, because I'm currently doing my next book has some ephemera, and one of the pages that's in there is like a page from an encyclopedia. So
she's doing it.
Martha, please, just have this one win.
Oh well. Oh, sorry,
Jordan. For a Tuesday.
Yes, I'm sorry. You knew when I asked you that something bad would happen to you.
Oh my gosh.
All right. Sorry. So, okay, back on track.
Yes. So let's talk about, and just a reminder, so we're going to get to audience questions in about a few more minutes. So you know what? Do you want to talk about own voices, or do you want to skip this question?
We can skip or talk if you want. It's often something that comes up, but it's not necessary.
All right, then let's talk about own voices. Now let's talk about own voices, and then we'll jump into audience questions, because you know me, I always have a little heartburn about this. So let's talk about own voices, and particularly pulling from your own history and experience, and versus, making things up or pulling from research. Do you ever feel, and I know you've had this conversation, so I know what your answer is. Do you ever feel as though you cannot necessarily show the actual truth about your experience because you risk alienating people or, opening yourself up to judgment?
What an incisive question, Justina. Not leading at all. I didn't do this task. Well, I wanted to talk about this, if you were willing, because I think it's something that comes up so often when marginalized authors are writing, especially when their characters represent or have an aspect of themselves represented on the page, if that wasn't like a bunch of words that really sounded okay. So obviously Jetta is bipolar, as am I, and I wanted to write a character. This was like a huge deal for me, to write a character in fantasy that was bipolar and all of the struggles that sort of went with it, but while also like kicking ass and like doing art and like doing all these fun things in a fantasy world. But as I was writing, I realized, especially as readers would talk to me about their own experiences, I had to portray the main character in a way that was more, I felt a responsibility to portray her in a way that was like an idealized version of how I would have responded in certain ways. Like personally, I have a very hard time with medication, and I've gone back and forth on it many times, and I am currently unmedicated and have been for like the last 6 or 7 years. And mostly it's been okay, although the last couple years,
the last couple of years have been kind of rough for all of us. Yeah.
But yeah, no, understandably so. But I think that in the story, I didn't want to hand, teenagers a book where the character isn't seeking medication or doesn't trust that process. In real life, like I tried lithium and it didn't really work very well for me. I tried a bunch of other things, and they all worked with varying amounts of success. But it was hard enough to go back and forth on trying things that like I didn't want to give a teenager like sort of like I didn't want to idealize anything, but I also didn't want to like give them like a weight that they didn't feel equipped to carry. Like I wanted to be more hopeful, I guess, than I had experienced some of my teenagerhood. But I think the parts that were important to me were actually that, like, if you do try, like, one of the inspirations was actually a story that I hope my husband can't hear me tell it, because when we were in our 20s and we had first like started really like dating seriously, he had a job and I didn't. He had health insurance and I didn't. And he is not mentally ill, but I am. And so we came up with a scheme, because the medication I was on was like $400, $500 a month, and I couldn't afford it. And so he actually went in and lied to the doctor to get, with my symptoms, to get medication for me. And I just remember going through all of these like this rigmarole to try to get treatment. And like, I wanted to portray a positive side of it, but not all of the bad, but I wanted to still give like that difficulty of like trying to get access to something. So it's kind of, I guess, a mishmash of difficult things, but also hopeful things that I really hope balance out for people with mental illness, balance out like the reality with like not being like, I don't know, like feeling like it's just carrying this like horrible burden of like, oh God, now what next? You know, it's hard.
Yeah, no, and I totally get that. It's one of the reasons I think the own voices designation is hard. I think it's hard on creators. I think it's definitely much easier for readers because they think that they know that what they're getting. But then there's also some sort of, baggage with that as well, because if you expect a certain kind of Black experience when you come to my books because you see its own voices and I don't deliver that, you're disappointed. And I don't want to like argue with people on Twitter who tell me I'm not Black enough or, queer enough or anything enough. And so I do think it's problematic, but I do I know what you're talking about, because one of the things that I had to balance with Dread Nation is like, it was really racist in 1880. How much of that do I show? And at what point does it impede your storytelling, right? At which point does it become like this very like depressing drum that we're beating along the way? You're like, racism's bad. Look, guys, and sometimes it's easier to really show characters overcoming those obstacles instead of just kind of like being bogged down in them. I also think it's really hard to write your own experience into your books. I mean, we all do it to some degree, but you never get like a man writing a book and then they say, why did you decide to write about a woman? Right. And well,
I say that.
We say that, but like nobody who likes the man who wrote that book. And like, I think that like when you're writing something that's within your marginalization or your identity, people really want to dig in on that sometimes in a way that feels kind of intrusive. So I sometimes, for me, I always write with a little bit of space between me and a character. So when people are like, what character are you most like in a book? I'm like, well, I'm a little bit like all of them, even the bad ones, right? Like, because like I wrote all those characters, so I created all of them. So I definitely understand that, especially when you're talking about mental health, because then also things like identity and mental health, like everyone has their own journey and everything's a little different. And you also risk the problem of people saying, well, you didn't write it right. like you didn't write my experience, so obviously you wrote it wrong, which is something a lot of, something like, honestly, like people who are part of the majority, like especially like, white authors don't have to necessarily deal with, because, they're not, there's a lot of books about, white main characters. I mean, like fewer as you go down the marginalizations, but like even then there are way more books about queer white kids than there are about queer kids of color. So like people tend to focus in on those. And I mean, especially mental health. There's only a handful of books that are about mental health, and very few of them are fantasy. So, so I appreciate that. It's a hard line to kind of walk a lot of times.
I agree. I think there's just like a heavy sense of gatekeeping from some people too. And it's not even just readers saying, oh, you didn't write it the way I experience it. But I think it's like people who maybe don't even share that feeling, but they say that, or that marginalization, but they say, well, you didn't write it the way I expected to see people like you. Or, I mean, I thankfully never have had this problem because I have an amazing editor and an amazing house. But like, I hear that all the time from, friends of ours.
So let's answer some questions.
Let's look.
All right. First one. Hi, Heidi. How do you come up with your character names?
Ooh, oh my gosh. That's like, so, gosh, that's a really good question. I haven't thought about it in a while. Some of the character names, usually my main character names come to me because they just sound right. And like, I can bear to see them written a million times and to think about them a million times because I'm always focusing on the main character first. But then out from there, I usually, I look at baby books, popular baby names. I mean, like sometimes I pull names of friends. A couple of them are like a couple of my dancer friends are, well, Cheeky is someone that I know in real life. Her name is Cheeky Lane, not Cheeky Toy, but she is like a very amazing dancer and she's always breaking boundaries and being very like in your face. So I tried to capture that character by naming her the same. Some names I don't know. I mean, some names I'm like, I love the name Theodora. So I felt like Theodora's brother should have a name that was somewhat similar because that they would tease each other about that. Although that teasing so his name is Leonin and Theodora, but it was like Leo and Theo. I imagine them teasing each other about it, but that never made it into the finished book. So it's all like kind of like, I don't know, all different ways. Now, I kind of need to know, though, about Ophelia, because Ophi's ghost, like, her name is Ophelia. I saw that name and I was like, why did you pick that? Because that is a very specific name.
Yeah. I mean, I always feel like Ophelia did wrong. Like, Shakespeare did her dirty.
It's so true. And Hamlet is so boring.
Yeah.
He's like such a boring character. And like, why? But anyway, but yes. Yeah. So is that really why you wanted to do right by the name?
Yeah, and like I've always liked that name. I always like Shakespeare names, but like, have you ever changed a name because it was too hard to keep typing throughout the book?
I feel like I must have, but I've definitely forgotten what the name was because that usually comes up very early.
There's a couple of them I've done. Like I keep mistyping the name or misspelling. I was like, you need a new name.
Yeah. No, I hear. Oh, one name got changed really late in these books. It was the brother. He had another L name or something that was too similar and like to a bunch of other names and so I changed it to Xavier and now I cannot remember what his original name was. But yeah, sometimes, I mean, it's all very different. Okay. Sorry.
All right. Next.
I wish I could remember what the original name was. Sorry. Next question.
So next one, curious about the songs from the audiobooks. Did you write the music as well as the lyrics for those? Also, isn't Emily Lou Zeller the best?
She is the best. She's absolutely the best. And whenever theater opens up again, I'm like, I have to see whatever she's in next because she's been amazing. She's also so professional behind the scenes. She's always emailing me and she comes up with these long spreadsheets about like pronunciations of words. And like she says, I just think it would be this way, but tell me if I'm wrong. She's absolutely wonderful to work with. But the songs from the audiobook. So I wrote the lyrics and I work with a composer and I've worked with him for a very long time. And he's the one who wrote the music. It's so funny. He's actually in a way the reason I got into writing YA because I used to write musical theater and he was my collaborator and he went away. He got hired to do to music direct a tour of the producers. And I was like all by myself and I had nothing to write. And I was like, well, I can't write music by myself. I can't write musical theater. Let me write a book. And that became The Girl from Everywhere. And then now I actually really missed working with him. So I was like, when we do music for the book, I really would love to work with you again. And so he's the one who did the music, Mike Petrie. He does a bunch of other things, video game music and other theater stuff as well.
That's awesome. Yeah. I'm always amazed that people write music because I am like, I'm not musical. I like music. But I'm one of those people who every single time they try to play an instrument, it's a terrible failure. So I'll just stick to writing books.
I hear you.
All right. So what inspired you to craft a fantasy based on Southeast Asian culture? Do you spend a lot of time planning your world building / researching before you write your books?
So this is, I wanted to base So I wanted to sort of base it on my upbringing, mostly at my upbringing in Hawaii. And so that's where it started. Sorry, my husband was like, "Oh, the baby's awake." Okay, so I'm going to be a little softer. But I grew up in Hawaii, and it's very jungle there. I'm half Chinese, and so I always had a sort of like my grandmother and my dad took me to Chinatown quite a bit, and so and I also was in a grade school all the way up to 8th grade that was a French language, dual language school. I had a scholarship there because my mom was like a big, she was a very famous artist in Hawaii in the 80s and 90s. And so I got a scholarship there because they wanted to have the daughter of the famous artist, whatever. So all of these things sort of came together in my head, like French language and like, Asian culture and like Hawaii and jungle and rainforest and all those sorts of things. And so they kind of lent themselves to a very oh, my baby's crying. Oh, I feel so bad. They lent themselves to the feeling of like Southeast Asia. So I definitely pulled from there as well. Being Chinese, but not being from China is one of those things that it's hard to feel fully rooted, especially since my family came to Hawaii so long ago and they, lost the ability to speak Chinese because they wanted to assimilate at the time. So I feel so bad, they're crying. So
you can do it. You got 4 more minutes.
I know. No. It's okay. So I tried to pull from a lot of Asian cultures, just a sort of a Pan-Asian feeling. And I did spend a lot of time, especially looking into the history of shadow puppetry and, leather work and sort of how it crossed from there was like a big, the French actually really did love shadow puppetry, like Chinese shadow puppetry, and then how it came through Southeast Asia, and then like they got really into it in the 1920s, and I read all about that. So I did a lot of research about that, and it actually, the follow-up question about the research that didn't make it into the books, I had this whole scene where she was like leather working, and I like ran it by someone who I know who is a leather expert. And they loved it. And I was like, you just love it because you're a leather expert. And so that had to go because it was boring to everyone else.
I was like, yeah, I don't. Sorry. I wanted
to leather working.
I know. It's an entire scene. All right. Yeah. So we got time for one more question. And why don't we do this one? What do you do for self-care?
Oh my gosh. I want to say I read, but I really read just like trash. I read like trash relationship Reddit stuff, like boring, like mindless.
Like the Am I the Asshole?
Yeah.
That's actually good for like character development and the r/relationships. Yeah. It's like, you're just like, girl, why are you with this person?
Exactly.
I always feel bad for like the women in these really terrible relationships. And I'm always like, why are there so many of you? Like,
and when you see an age gap,
you know it's going to be a mess.
Yeah.
Well, that takes us to time. So, yay!
Thank you so much, Justina. Welcome back, Kellyanne.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys both for being here, and big virtual round of applause to our authors because they're both East Coast time, so they are troopers for doing this. Thank you guys so much, and hope the baby stops crying.
Thank you.
One last time before we all say goodnight, don't forget that you can purchase both Heidi and Justina's books by pressing that green Buy Books with Signed Book Plate button. And with that, see everyone next time. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.